So we're going to put together the demand for labour with the supply of labour, and we know where they meet. That's going to be the equilibrium wage level for different industries. So we've got on the left-hand side relatively elastic supply of labour and relatively elastic demand of labour compared to this relatively inelastic supply and inelastic demand of labour. And these are the specification objectives that we need to cover. So in terms of changes in wages, we know from AS Year 1 microeconomics that it would be a change in the price is either caused by a shift in demand or a shift in supply, or sometimes a shift in both of them. So any shift in demand, we know from the marginal revenue product theory, is caused by a change in the price of the final output because labour is derived demand, or a change in productivity. So if we have an increase in the price and increase in productivity, we're going to have to see demand for labour shift outwards. If we have a decrease in the price of the final output, a decrease in productivity, demand is going to shift inwards. But remember your depends upon factors. So whenever demand shifts, the effect on the market, the effect on the number of people employed and the wage rate is going to depend upon the PES factors. So time, are we looking at the short run and the long run? Remember, in the long run, everything is much more elastic. The amount of training needed, that would make supply very inelastic if there's a large amount of training or qualifications needed. And if it's a vacation, if it's all about the job, it's more than a job to the person, then that tends to make it inelastic as well. Shifts in supply. Now there were more things on my slides than I've just listed here. I've just put a few factors, but remember the rewards that the person gets, apart from the monetary rewards, we're looking at the other things as well: job satisfaction, the conditions, the opportunities, promotion, status, all of those types of things that are in the market. Because remember, when we're looking at our demand and supply diagram, I'll just go back to it, the wage is already there. So we're kind of taking the wage out of the equation when we're thinking about, well, why might supply shift? Just be a bit kind of cautious with that. Obviously, an increase in wages is going to cause there to be more people willing to supply their labour, but that is actually a shift in demand that's causing a movement along the supply curve. So something that actually shifts the supply curve in and out is going to be those non-wage factors. And we know we can evaluate this and go a little bit further with our analysis. So the effect on the market in terms of how many people are employed and the wage level is going to depend upon the PED, the price elasticity of demand for labour. So time, again, availability of substitutes, the wage costs relative to total costs, and the elasticity of the final product produced. So here we're seeing an example here of a lot of supply for a product, maybe, a lot of supply of labour to a particular industry. Maybe this is where there are very few qualifications needed, but we have quite a large amount of demand as well for it. And here we have very inelastic supply, but there's a much smaller quantity of supply in this market, this industry, than in the industry here. So we can see that the wage here is a lot higher. We're going to see if supply adjusts, if supply shifts here because the demand is very inelastic. If supply reduces, we're going to see a much larger increase in the wage rate than if supply reduced in this market here, because the price elasticity of demand is elastic in this case here and inelastic here. So a few more key terms for you to learn as well. Transfer earnings. Now this is the minimum needed to keep a factory of production in its current occupation. So I always tell my students that this is very similar to that concept of normal profit. This is enough to keep this entrepreneur in this particular industry, whereas economic rent is the payment above the amount needed to keep a factory of production in its current occupation. So it's a bit like the supernormal profit to the entrepreneur. And on a diagram we can illustrate it here, where we get the equilibrium The top of the box here, bordered by the supply of labour, is the economic rent, and below are the transfer earnings. Now, the price elasticity of supply will determine the share of the total amount that the wages in this industry. It will determine how much of that share, by the total amount of wages in the industry, what I'm talking about is box there. So a bit like when we're talking about products, we're talking about revenue. This box represents the total amount that's paid to labour in the industry. And depending on how elastic or inelastic the supply of labour is, it will determine the amount of economic rent paid and the transfer earnings paid. So if you have a look at this diagram, this was taken from a previous video where I was talking about elasticity of the supply of labour, and we've got different elasticities here. If I just put in a demand curve, and I'll use the same demand curve for each of them, we can see this would be the different wage rates in these markets, and we can see these yellow boxes are showing the economic rent, and the yellow boxes are of different sizes. We can see that it's a much smaller area in this supply 3 is very elastic. So the more elastic your supply of labour is, the smaller the economic rent becomes. The more inelastic the supply of labour is, the larger the economic rent is.